record on this computer. Thank you. Okay. So Nick and Katie. Yes, I do. Right. I think you guys are the hosts now.
Now automated background.
How exciting! Right.
Story time.
Story time. Hold on, let me go and get a glass of water.
Fraught excitement.
Right.
You're not allowed to start till Nick gets back.
Okay. Roger that. Well, you are the juice, so I feel like you definitely have that authority. How is everyone else, by the way, just until Nick and Katie return? Pretty good? Getting nods?
Pretty good.
Yeah. I'm good. Excellent.
Very cool.
The odds are high I'll fall asleep tonight, but that's fine.
I love you falling asleep in story time.
Good.
Oh, it's cute.
Very cute.
Zach, have you got your jammers on already?
Obviously.
Nice.
Well, you expect me to be in bed without pajamas on? That's silly.
Right.
Sorry.
Oh, Frankie.
Oh. That's
Hot.
Buggers.
Right. Katie and Nick, this means you're also going to be on muting and unmuting duty.
How do we do that?
I reckon we can manage that.
Great fun.
I've got every faith in you.
You tall.
That look of intense concentration.
That's Frankie.
It's fine. I unmuted myself. It's all good.
Oh, well done.
This is very exciting. This will be very exciting for the people watching it in catch up. Right. And are you also, will you be able to just put it on speak of you when story time begins? Thank you. So, should we do this? Do this? Oh, I can see control. Yeah, thumbs up all around. Right. So, the king is dead. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. Chapter 23. There were people everywhere shouting. Guards, servants, ministers, physicians, all crowding around the body of the king as close as they could get. Marek had set the 3 guards to watch him and vanished. I was pushed up to the side of the room like flotsam on the tide, my eyes closing as I sagged against a bookcase. Kasia pushed through to my side. "Agnieszka, what should I do?" she asked me, helping me to sit on a footstool. I said, "Go and get Alosha," instinctively wanting someone who would know what to do. It was a lucky impulse. One of Ballow's assistants had survived. He'd fled and pulled himself up into the stone chimney of the library's great fireplace to escape. A guard noticed the claw marks on the hearth and the ashes of the fire all raked out over the floor, and they found him still up there, shaking and terrified. They brought him out and gave him a drink, and then he stood up and pointed at me and blurted, "It was her! She was the one who found it!" I was dizzy and ill and still shaking with thunder. They all began shouting at me. I tried to tell them about the book, how it had been hiding in the library all this time, but they wanted someone to blame more than they wanted someone to explain. The smell of pine needles came into my nostrils. 2 guards seized me by the arms, and I think they would have dragged me to the dungeons in a minute, or worse. Someone said, "She's a witch! If we let her get her strength back again." Alosha made them stop. She came into the room and clapped her hands 3 times. Everyone quieted long enough to listen to her. "Put her down in that chair and stop behaving like fools," she said. "Take hold of Jakob instead. He was here in the middle of it. Didn't any of you have the wits to suspect he'd been touched with corruption too?" She had authority. They all knew her, especially the guards, who went as stiff and formal as if she were a general. They let go of me and caught poor protesting Jakob instead. They dragged him up to Alosha, still bleating. "But she did! Father Ballo said she found the book." "Be quiet," Alosha said, taking out her dagger. "Hold his wrist," she told one of the guards, and had them pin the apprentice's arm to the table by the wrist, palm up. She muttered a spell over it and nicked his elbow, then held the blade beside the bleeding cut. He squirmed and struggled in their grip, moaning, and then thin black wisps. She rotated the dagger slowly, collecting up the wisps like thread on a bobbin until the smoke stopped coming. Alosha held the dagger up and looked at it with narrowed eyes, said "Hulva del Voveta," and blew on it 3 times. The blade grew brighter and brighter with every breath, glowing hot, and the smoke burned off with a smell like sulphur. The room had emptied considerably by the time she was done, and everyone left had backed away to the walls, except the pale, unhappy guards still holding the apprentice. "All right, give him some bandages. Stop shouting, Jakob," she said. "I was there when she found it, you idiot. The book was here in our own library for years, lurking like a rotting apple. Ballo was going to purge it. What happened?" Jakob didn't know. He'd been sent to fetch supplies. The king hadn't been there when he'd left. When he'd come back carrying more salt and herbs, the king and his guards had been standing by the podium with blank faces, and Ballo was reading the book aloud, already changing. Clawed legs coming from beneath his robe, and 2 more sprouting from his sides, tearing their way out, his face lengthening into a snout, the words still coming even as they garbled and choked in his throat. Jakob's voice rose higher and higher as he spoke until it broke and stopped. His hands were shaking. Alosha poured more Nalveka into a glass for him to drink. "It's stronger than we thought," she said. "We have to burn it at once." I struggled up off my footstool, but Alosha shook her head at me. "You're overspent. Go sit on the hearth and keep watch on me. Don't try to do anything unless you see it's taking me." The book still lay placidly on the floor between the shattered pieces of the stone table, illuminated and innocent. Alosha took a pair of gauntlets from one of the guards. She took it to the hearth and called fire. "Poljit, Poljit Molin, Poljit Halo," and on further from there, a long incantation, and the dull ashes in the hearth roared up like the blaze of her forge. The fire licked at the pages and gummed them, but the book only flung itself open in the fire, and its pages ruffled like flags in a high wind, snapping. Pictures of beasts trying to catch the eye, illuminated with firelight behind them. "Get back," Alosha said sharply to the guards. A few of them had been about to take a step closer, their eyes vague and caught. She reflected firelight into their faces from the flat of her dagger, and they blinked and then startled back, pale and afraid. Alosha watched with a wary eye until they moved farther away, then turned back and kept chanting her fire spell over and over, her arms spread wide to hold the fire in. But the book still hissed and spat on the hearth like wet green wood, refusing to catch. The fresh smell of spring leaves crept into the room, and I could see veins standing out on Alosha's neck, strain showing in her face. She had her eyes fixed on the mantelpiece, but they kept drifting downward towards the glowing pages. Each time she pressed her thumb against the edge of her dagger. Blood dripped. She lifted her gaze back up. Her voice was going hoarse. A handful of orange sparks landed on the carpet and smouldered. Sitting tired on the footstool, I looked at them and slowly I began to hum the old song about the spark on the hearth, telling its long stories. Once there was a golden princess, loved a simple player. The king gave them a splendid wedding, and the story ends there. Once there was old Baba Yaga, house made out of butter, and in that house so many wonders. The spark is gone now. Gone. Taking the story with it. I sang it once through softly and said, Kikra, Kikra, and then sang it again. The flying sparks began to drop onto the pages like rain, each one darkening a tiny spot before they went out. They fell in glowing showers, and when they fell in clusters, thin plumes of smoke went up. Alosha slowed and stopped. The fire was catching at last. The pages were curling in on themselves at the edges like small animals huddling to die, with a burnt sugar smell of sap in the fire. Kasha took my arm gently, and we backed away from the fire while it slowly ate up the book like someone forcing herself to eat stale bread. How did this bestiary come to your hands? One minister bellowed at me, seconded by half a dozen more. Why was the king there? The council chamber was full of nobles shouting at me, at Alosha, at one another, afraid, demanding answers that weren't to be had for the king, and talked of throwing me in the dungeons. Some others decided, on no evidence at all, that shivering Jakub was a Russian agent who'd lured the king to the library and tricked Father Ballo into reading the book. He began to weep and make protests, but I didn't have the strength to defend myself against them. My mouth stretched into an involuntary yawn instead and made them angrier. I didn't mean to be disrespectful. I just couldn't help it. I couldn't get enough air. I couldn't think. My hands were still stinging with lightning, and my nose was full of smoke, of burning paper. None of it seemed real to me yet. The king dead? Father Ballo dead? I had seen them barely an hour ago, walking away from the war conference, whole and healthy. I remembered the moment too vividly. The small worried crease in Father Ballo's forehead, the king's blue boots. In the library, Alosha had done a purging spell over the king's body. Then the priests had carried him away to the cathedral for vigil, wrapped hastily in a cloth. The boots had been sticking out the end of the bundle. The magnati kept shouting at me. It didn't help that I felt I was to blame. I'd known something was wrong. If I'd only been quicker, if I'd only burned the book myself when I first found it. I put my stinging hands over my face. But Marek stood up next to me and shouted the nobles down with the authority of the bloody spear he was still holding. He slammed it down on the council table in front of them. She slew the beast when it might have killed Solya and another dozen men besides, he said. We don't have time for this sort of idiocy. We march on the River in 3 days' time. We march nowhere without the king's word, one of the ministers dared to shout. Lucky for him, he was across the table and out of arm's reach. Even so, he shrank back from Marek, leaning across the table, mailed hand clenched into a fist, rage illuminating him with righteous wrath. He's not wrong, Alosha said sharply, putting a hand down in front of Marek and making him straighten up to face her. This is no time to be starting a war. Half of the magnati along the table were snarling and clawing at each other, blaming Rossia, blaming me, even blaming poor Father Ballo. The throne stood empty at the tent of the table. Crown Prince Sigmund sat to the right of it. His hands were clenched around each other into a single joined fist. He stared at it without speaking while the shouting went on. The Queen sat on the left. She still wore Ragostok's golden circlet above the smooth, shining satin of her black gown. I noticed dully that she was reading a letter. A messenger was standing by her elbow with an empty dispatch bag. The Queen stood up. My lords. Heads turned to look at her. She held up the letter, a short folded piece of paper. She'd broken the red seal. A Rossian army has been sighted coming for the Raidva. They will be there in the morning. No one let out a word. We must put aside our mourning and our anger, she said. I stared up at her. The very portrait of a queen, proud, defiant, her chin raised. Her voice rang clearly in the stone hall. This is no hour for Polnya to show weakness. She turned to the Crown Prince. His face was turned up towards her just like mine, startled and open as a child's, his mouth loosely parted over words that weren't coming. Sigmund, they have only sent 4 companies. If you put the troops already muster out. I should be the one who, Marek said, rousing to protest, but Queen Hanna held up her hand and he stopped. Prince Marek will stay here and secure the capital with a royal guard, gathering the additional levies that are coming in, she said, turning back to the court. He will be guided by the council's advice and, I hope, my own. Surely there is nothing else to be done. The Crown Prince stood. We will do as the Queen proposes, he said. Marek's cheeks were purpling with frustration, but he blew out a breath and said sourly, Very well. Just that quickly, everything seemed decided. The ministers began at once to take themselves off busily in every direction, glad of order restored. There wasn't a moment to protest, a moment to suggest any other course. There wasn't a chance to stop it. I stood up. No, I said, wait! But no one was listening. I reached for the last dregs of my magic to make my voice louder, to make them turn back. Wait, I tried to say, and the room swam away into black around me. I woke up in my room and sat straight up in one jerk, all the hair standing on my arms and my throat burning. Kasia was sitting on the foot of my bed, and the willow was straightening up away from me with a thin, disapproving expression on her face, a potion bottle in her hand. I didn't remember how I'd got there. I looked out the window, confused. The sun had moved. You fell down in the council room, Kasia said. I couldn't stir you. You were overspent, the willow said. No, don't try to rise. You'd better stay just where you are, and don't try to use magic again for at least a week. It's a cup that needs to be refilled, not an endless stream. But the Queen, I blurted, the wood. Ignore me if you like, and spend your last dregs and die. I shan't have anything to say about it, said the willow, dismissive. I don't know how Kasia had persuaded her to come see me, but from the cold look they exchanged as the willow swept past her and out the door, I didn't think it had been very gently. I knuckled my eyes and lay there in the pillows. The potion the willow had given me was a churning, glowing warmth in my belly, like I'd eaten something with too many hot peppers in it. Alosha told me to get the willow to look at you, Kasia said, still leaning worried over me. She said she was going to stop the Crown Prince from going. I gathered my strength and struggled up, grabbing for Kasia's hands. The muscles of my stomach were aching and weak. But I couldn't keep to my bed right now, whether I could use magic or not. A heaviness lingered in the air of the castle, that terrible pressure. The wood was still here, somehow. The wood hadn't finished with us yet. We have to find her. The guards at the Crown Prince's room were on high alert. They half wanted to bar us coming in, but I called out, "Alosha!" And when she put her head out and spoke to them, they let us into the skelter of packing underway. The Crown Prince wasn't in full armour yet, but he had on his greaves and a mail shirt, and he had a hand on his son's shoulder. His wife, Princess Malogazata, stood with him holding the little girl in her arms. The boy had a sword, a real sword with an edge made small enough for him to hold. He wasn't 7 years old. I would have given money that a child that young would cut off a finger within a day, his or someone else's, but he held it as expertly as any soldier. He was presenting it across his palms to his father with an anxious, upturned face. "I won't be any trouble," he said. "You have to stay and look after Marisha," the prince said, stroking the boy's head. He looked at the princess. Her face was sober. He didn't kiss her, but he kissed her hand. "I'll be back as soon as I can." "I'm thinking of taking the children to Gidna once the funeral is over," the princess said. I knew vaguely it was the name of the city she was from, the ocean port the marriage had opened to Polnya. "The sea air will be healthy for them, and my parents haven't seen Marisha since her christening." From the words, you would have thought she just had the idea a moment ago, but as she said them, they sounded rehearsed. "I don't want to go to Gidna," the boy said. "Papa!" "Enough, Stashek," the prince said. "Whatever you think best," he told the princess, and turned to Alosha. "Will you put a blessing on my sword?" "I'd rather not," she said grimly. "Why are you lending yourself to this? After we spoke yesterday my father was alive," Prince Sigmund said. "Today, he's dead. What do you think is going to happen when the Magnati vote on the succession? If I let Marek go and he destroys this Rosyan army for us?" "So send a general," Alosha said, but she wasn't really arguing. I could tell she was only saying it while she searched for another answer that she believed in. "What about Baron Golshkin?" "I can't," he said. "If I don't ride out at the head of this army, Marek will. Do you think there's any general I could appoint who would stand in the way of the hero of Polnya right now? The whole country is ringing with his song." "Only a fool would put Marek on the throne instead of you," Alosha said. "Men are fools," Sigmund said. "Give me the blessing, and keep an eye on the children for me." We stayed and watched him ride away. The two small children knelt up on a footstool, peering over the windowsill with their mother behind them, her hands on their heads, golden and dark. He went with a small troop of guards for escort, his retinue, the eagle flag in red on white billowing out behind him. Alosha watched silently behind me from the second window until they had gone out of the courtyard. Then she turned to me and said dourly, "There's always a price." "Yes," I said, low and tired. And I didn't think we were done paying. Chapter 24. I couldn't do anything more just then but sleep. Alosha told me to lie down right there in the room, despite the princess's dubious looks, and I fell asleep on the soft wool rug before the fireplace. It was woven in a strange dancing pattern of enormous curved raindrop shapes, or perhaps tears. The stone floor beneath was hard, but I was too tired to care. I slept the whole evening and night, and woke in the early hours of the morning. Still tired, but my head less thick, and my lightning-scorched palms felt cool to the touch again. Magic ran whispering and slow over rocks deep inside me. Kasia was sleeping on the rug at the foot of the bed. Through the bed curtains, I could see the princess with the 2 children gathered close beside her. There were 2 guards drowsing on either side of the door. Alosha was sitting up in a chair by the fire with the hungry sword on her lap, sharpening it with her finger. I could feel the whisper of her magic as she ran the pad of her thumb near the edge of the blade. A thin line of blood welled up on her dark skin, even though she wasn't actually touching the steel, and it lifted in a faint red mist to sink into the blade. Her chair was turned to have full view of the doors and windows, as though she'd been watching all night. "What do you fear?" I asked her softly. "Everything," she said. "Anything. Corruption in the palace. The king dead, Ballo dead, the crown prince lured off to a battlefield where anything might happen. It's late enough to start being cautious. I can miss a few nights' sleep. Are you better?" I nodded. "Good. Listen to me. We need to root out this corruption in the palace, and quickly. I don't believe we made an end of it when we destroyed that book." I sat up and hugged my knees. Sarkhan thought it might be the queen after all, that she might have been tortured into helping instead of corrupted. I wondered if he was right. If the queen had smuggled out a small golden fruit somehow, plucked up off the ground in the wood, and now in some dark corner of the palace gardens, a thin silver sapling had broken the earth, scattering corruption all around. It was hard for me to imagine the queen so lost to everything she'd been that she would bring the wood with her, that she'd turn it on her own family and kingdom. But Alosha said she might not have needed much torment to help see her husband dead after he abandoned her for 20 years in the wood. And perhaps her elder son, too, she added as I flinched in protest. I notice Marek is the one she kept from the front. In any case, it's safe enough to say she's at the center of what's happening. Can you put this summoning of yours on her?" I was silent. I remembered the throne room where I'd thought of casting the summoning on the queen. Instead, I'd chosen to give the court an illusion, a theatrical to win Kasia's pardon. Maybe that had been the mistake after all. "But I don't think I can do it alone," I said. I had the feeling summoning wasn't really meant to be cast alone, as if truth didn't mean anything without someone to share it with. You could shout truth into the air forever and spend your life doing it if someone didn't come and listen. Alosha shook her head. "I can't help you. I won't leave the princess and the royal children unguarded until I see them safely to Gidna." Reluctantly, I said, "Solya might help me." The last thing I wanted was to cast a spell with him and give him any more reasons to keep grasping at my magic, but maybe his sight would make the spell stronger. "Solya." Alosha loaded his name with disapproval. "Well, he's been a fool, but he's not stupid. You may as well try him. If not, go to Ragostok. He's not as strong as Solya, but he might be able to manage it." "Will he help me?" I said doubtfully, remembering the circlet on the queen's head. He hadn't liked me much either. "When I say so, he will," Alosha said. "He's my great-great-grandson. If he argues, tell him to come speak to me." "Yes, I know he's an ass," she said, misunderstanding my stare, and sighed. "The only child of my line to show magic, at least in Polnya." She shook her head. "It's cropped up in my favorite granddaughter's children and grandchildren, but she married a man from Venetia and went south with him. It would take more than a month to send for one of them." "Do you have much family left besides them?" I asked timidly. "Oh, I have 67 great-great-grandchildren, I think," she said after a moment's thought. "Perhaps more by now. They drift away little by little. A few of them write to me dutifully every midwinter. Most of them don't remember that they're descended from me if they ever knew. It only keeps them from burning in the sun, and my husband is 140 years dead. She said it easily, as if it didn't matter anymore. I suppose it didn't. And that's all? I said. I felt almost desperate. Great-great-grandchildren, half of them lost and the rest of them so distant that she could sigh over Ragostock and feel nothing more than a mild irritation. They didn't seem enough to keep her rooted to the world. I didn't have any other king to begin with. My mother was a slave from Namib, but she died having me, so that's all I know of her. A baron in the south bought her from a Mondrian trader to give his wife consequence. They were kind enough to me even before my gift came out, but it was the kindness of masters. They weren't kin. She shrugged. I've had lovers now, flowers. You know the bloom will fade even as you put them in the glass. I couldn't help bursting out. Then why be here at all? Why do you care about Polya or anything? I'm not dead, Alosha said tartly. And I've always cared about good work. Polya's had a line of good kings. They've served their people, built libraries and roads, raised up the university, and been good enough at war to keep their enemies from overrunning them and smashing everything. They've been worthy tools. I might leave if they grew wicked and bad. I certainly wouldn't put swords in men's hands to follow that damned hothead Marek into a dozen wars for glory. But Sigmund, he's a sensible man and good to his wife. I'm glad enough to help him hold up the walls. She saw the misery on my face, and with rough kindness said, "You learn to feel it less, child, or you learn to love other things. Like poor Ballo," she said, with a kind of dusty, wistful regret, not strong enough to call grief. He lived for 40 years in a monastery, illuminating manuscripts before anyone noticed he wasn't growing older. He was always a little surprised to find himself a wizard, I think. She went back to her sharpening, and I went out of the room, sore and more unhappy than before I'd asked. I thought of my brothers growing old, of my little nephew Danushek bringing me his ball with his frowning little serious face, that face becoming an old man's, tired and folded and worn with years. Everyone I knew buried, and only their children's children left to love. But better that than no one left at all. Better those children running in the forest, safe to run there. If I was strong, if I'd been given strength, I could be a shield for them, for my family, for Kasia, for those two small children sleeping in the bed, and all the others who slept in the shadows of the wood. I told myself that, and tried to believe it would be enough. But it was still a cold and bitter thought to have, alone in the dark hallway. A few of the lower maids were just beginning to get the day's work underway, creeping quietly in and out of the nobles' rooms to stir up the fires, just the same as the day before, even though the king was dead. Life went on. Solya said, "We don't need the fire tended, Lisbetta. Just bring us some hot tea and breakfast, there's a girl," when I opened up his door. His fire was already up and mouthing a pair of fresh logs in a large stone fireplace. No small gargoyle, 3 times as large as the one they'd crammed me into. His stone floors were covered in piled white rugs, soft and thick. He must have used magic to keep them clean. A large canopied bed, rumpled and untidy, was visible in the second room through a pair of open doors. Along the broad wooden panel at its foot, a carved falcon flew, its eye made of a single large, smooth-polished golden stone with a black slitted pupil staring out at us. A round table stood in the middle of the room, and Marek was sitting at it next to Solya, sprawled long and sulky in a chair with his boots up, in a night shift and fur-edged dressing gown over his trousers. A silver stand on the table held a tall oval mirror as long as my arm. After a moment, I realised I wasn't looking from some peculiar angle and seeing the bed curtains. The mirror wasn't showing a reflection at all. Like some impossible window, it looked out into a tent, the swaying pole in the middle holding up the draped sides, and front opening in a narrow triangle slice looking out onto a green field. Solya was looking into the mirror intently, a hand on the frame and his eyes nothing but black wells of pupil, absorbing everything. Marek watched his face. Neither one of them noticed me until I was at their elbows, and even then Marek barely glanced away. "Where have you been?" he said, and without waiting for an answer added, "Stop disappearing before I have to put a bell on you. Rossia must have a spy in this castle to have learned we were going for the Rydva, if not half a dozen of them. I want you by me from now on." "I've been sleeping," I said tartly, before I remembered he'd lost his father yesterday and felt a little sorry. But he didn't look much like he'd been in mourning. I suppose being to one another, and he'd never forgiven his father for letting the Queen fall into the wood. But I still would have expected to find him a little red-eyed, from confusion, if not from love. "Yes, well, what else is there to do but sleep?" he said sourly, and glared at the mirror again. "Where the hell are all of them?" "On the field by now," Solya said absently without drawing his eyes away. "Where I should be if Sigmund wasn't a lickspittle politician," Marek said. "You mean if Sigmund were a perfect idiot, which he's not," Solya said. "He couldn't possibly hand you a triumph right now unless he wanted to hand you the crown along with it. I assure you he knows we've got 50 votes in the Magnati already." "And what of it? If he can't hold the nobles, he doesn't deserve it," Marek snapped, folding his arms across his chest. "If I were only there..." Indignation. So it wasn't just Sigmund worrying the Magnati would give Marek the throne. Marek was trying to take it. Suddenly I understood the crown princess, why she'd looked sidelong at me. I was Marek's ally as far as she knew. But I swallowed the first 10 remarks that came to my tongue and said shortly to Solya, "I need your help." That won me a look from one of those pit-black eyes, at least, with an arched eyebrow to go over it. "I'm equally delighted to help you, my dear, and to hear you say so." "I want you to cast a spell with me," I said. "We need to put the summoning on the Queen." He paused, much less delighted. Marek turned and threw me a hard look. "Now what's gotten into your head?" "Something's wrong," I said to him. "You can't pretend not to have seen. Since we came back, there's been one disaster after another. The king, Father Ballo, the war against Rossia. This has all been the wood's design. The summoning will show us..." "What?" Marek snapped, standing up. "What do you think it will show us?" He loomed over me. I stood my ground and flung my head back. "The truth," I said. "It's not 3 days since we let her out of the tower, and the king is dead, there are monsters in the palace, and Polya's at war. We've missed something." I turned to Solya. "Will you help me?" Solya glanced between Marek and me, calculations ticking in his eyes. Then he said mildly, "The Queen is pardoned, Agnieszka. We can't simply go enchanting her with no cause only because you're alarmed." You must see something's wrong, I said to him furiously. There was something wrong, Solia said, condescending and complacent. I could have shaken him with pleasure. Too late. I had to be sorry I hadn't made a friend of him. I couldn't tempt him. He knew perfectly well by now that I didn't mean to make any regular occasion of sharing magic with him, even if I'd suffer through it for something important. Very wrong. That corrupted book you found, now destroyed. There's no need to imagine dark causes when we have one already known. And the last thing Polya needs now is more black gossip flying around, Marek said more calmly. His shoulders were relaxing as he listened to Solia, swallowing down that poisonously convenient explanation. He dropped back into his chair and put his boots up on the table again. About my mother, or you, for that matter. The Magnati have all been summoned for the funeral, and I'll be announcing our betrothal once they're gathered. What? I said. He might have been giving me some piece of mildly interesting news, which concerned me only a little. You've earned it, slaying that monster, and it's the sort of thing commoners love. Don't make a fuss, he added, without even looking at me. Polya is in danger, and I need you at my side. I only stood there, too angry to even find my voice, but they had stopped paying attention to me anyway. In the mirror, someone was ducking into the tent. An old man in a much decorated uniform sank heavily into the chair on the other side, his face pulled down on all sides by age. Jowls sagging, moustaches sagging, pouches beneath his eyes and the corners of his mouth. There were lines of sweat running through the dust caked on his face. Savienna, Marek said, leaning in, fiercely intent. What's happening? Did the Rossians have time to fortify their positions? No, the old general said, wiping a tired hand across his forehead. They didn't fortify the crossings. They laid an ambush on the long bridge instead. Stupid of them, Marek said, intently. Without fortifications, they can't possibly hold the crossings for more than a couple of days. Another 2,000 levies came in overnight. If I ride out with them at once, we overran them at dawn, Savienna said. They are all dead. 6,000. Marek paused, evidently taken aback. He hadn't expected that. He exchanged a look with Solia, scowling a little as though he didn't like hearing it. How many did you lose? He demanded. 4,000. Too many horses. We overran them, Savienna said, his voice breaking, sagging where he sat. Not all the tracks on his face were sweat. Marek, forgive me. Marek, your brother is dead. They killed him in the first ambush when he went to survey the river. I backed away from the table as if I could escape from the words. The little boy upstairs holding out his sword. I won't be any trouble. His round face upturned. The memory jabbed me, knife sharp. Marek had gone silent. His face was bewildered more than anything. Solia went on speaking with the general a little longer. I could scarcely bear to hear them go on talking. Finally, Solia reached up and drew a heavy cloth down over the mirror. He turned to look at Marek. The bewilderment was fading. By God, Marek said after a moment, I would rather not have it than have it so. Solia only inclined his head, watching him with a gleam in his eye. But that's not the choice, after all. No, Solia agreed softly. It's just as well the Magnati are on their way. We'll hold the confirmation vote at once. There was salt in my mouth. I'd been crying without knowing it. I backed up farther. The doorknob came into my hand, the hollows and bumps of its carved hawk's head pressing into my palm. I turned it and slipped out the door and shut it behind me quietly. I stood trembling in the hallway. Alosha had been right. One trap after another, long buried under a carpet of thick leaves, finally springing shut. Tiny seedlings pushing grasping branches out of the dirt. One trap after another. All at once I was running. I ran, my boots slapping on stone, past startled servants and the morning sun bright in all the windows. I was panting by the time I rounded the corner to the quarters of the Crown Prince. The door was shut, but unguarded. A thin grey haze trickled from underneath it into the hallway. The knob was hot under my hand as I threw the door open. The bed hangings were aflame, and the carpet scorched. The guards were dead, huddled heaps on the floor. There were 10 men in a silent knot around Alosha. She was burned horribly. Half her armour melted onto her skin, and somehow still fighting. Behind her, the princess lay dead, barring the door to the wardrobe with her own body. Kasha was next to her corpse, her own clothes sliced in a dozen places but her skin unmarked. She was holding a chipped sword and swinging it fiercely at 2 men trying to get past her. Alosha was holding off the rest with 2 long knives that sang wildly in the air and left crackles of fire behind them. She'd cut them all to ribbons, blood slick on the floor, but they weren't falling down. The men wore Rossian uniforms, but their eyes were green and lost up and down the middle. I wanted to scream, to weep. I wanted to drag my hand across the world and wipe it all away. Hulvad, I said, my hands pushing magic out with it. Hulvad! Remembering how Alosha had pulled that thin cloud of corruption out of Balo's apprentice. And wisps of black smoke came streaming out of the men, out of every slash and knife wound. The smoke blew away through the open window into the sunlight, and then they were only men again, hurt too much to live. They fell to the ground, one after another. With her attackers gone, Alosha turned and threw her knives at the men trying to kill Kasha. The knives sank deep into their backs, and more of that evil smoke billowed out from around the blades. They fell, 1 and 2. The room was strangely quiet when they were all dead. The door pushed open a crack and Kasha willed towards it. Stashek was inside, trying to look out, his face scared, his small sword gripped in his hand. "Don't look," she said. She pulled a cloak out of the wardrobe, long, rich, red velvet. She covered the children's head with it and gathered them into her arms. "Don't look," she said, and held them huddled close against her. "Mama," the little girl said. "Be quiet," the boy told her, his voice trembling. I covered my mouth with both my hands and crammed in a sob. Alosha was dragging in heavy, laboured breaths. Blood bubbled on her lips. She sagged against the bed. I stumbled forward and reached for her, but she waved me back. She made a hooking gesture with a hand and said, "Hator," and drew the killing sword out. "Whatever's in the wood," she said, hoarse and whispering, her voice eaten by the fire. "Find it and kill it before it's too late." I took it and held it awkwardly. Alosha was sliding to the floor even as she let it go into my hands. I knelt down beside her. "We have to get the willow," I said. She shook her head, a tiny movement. "Go. Get the children out of here," she said. "The castle's not safe. Go." She let her head sink back against the bed, her eyes closing. Her chest rose and fell only in shallow breaths. I stood up, shaking. I knew she was right. I felt it. The king, the crown prince, now the princess. The wood meant to kill all of them. Alosha's good kings, and slaughter Polnia's wizards too. I looked at the dead soldiers in their Rossian uniforms. Marek would blame Rossia again, as he was meant to do. He put on his crown and marched east, and after he'd spent our army slaughtering as many Rossians as he could, the wood would devour him too, and leave the country torn apart, the succession broken. I was in the wood again, underneath the boughs, that cold, hateful presence watching me. The momentary silence in the room was only its pause for breath. Stone walls and sunlight meant nothing. The wood's eyes were on us. The wood was here.
Holy fuck.
Oh, heck.
Right?
Wow.
You're right about the shit is in the fan. Definitely much so.
I'm gonna stop.
What's that, love?
It ain't gonna slow down.
It ain't gonna slow down yet.
All right. Oh, blimey.
Buckle in, everybody. Woo!
Oh,
Are we all feeling
Fucking stressed, man.
stressed and unhappy?
Am I still not allowed to read on, Frankie?
No.
What's that, my love?
Am I still not allowed to read it?
You're not allowed to read it. You're not allowed to read it. We're so close. You haven't got much longer.
But it keeps getting harder.
Yep.
it's good for you.
It's good for you, yeah, exactly. Moral fiber.
What is it?
Read it.
So, what do we think? What's going to happen?
Oh,
Everyone's going to die. It's going to turn into George R. R. Martin.
There's been a big misunderstanding.
And then she woke up and it was all a dream.
I'd like to think that they got their act together and all the cities banded together and fought the wood as one. But whether that's a bit wishful thinking, I don't know. It sounds
Mike,
a bit too...
you are too pure and good for this world.
Yeah.
You're too pure and good for this world.
I think she'll find out that she's the one that's corrupted and is spreading the corruption, and she'll have to kill herself.
Or Kasha.
You are too dark for this world.
It's nice to have both ends of the spectrum so clearly delineated.
Between
I
the
have
two
a suspicion against the Falcon.
Yeah, I suspect the Falcon. He's an absolute cunt.
he's awful.
Actually, the dragon hasn't been mentioned for a while, so I'm guessing the dragon's due for a monumental return in the closing chapter.
Oh, absolutely. Also, I really hate Marek for going, I'm going to be king. And by the way, you're going to be my wife.
Yeah. To sleep. It's Queen. Yeah, exactly. Let's not hope that doesn't happen.
It feels like Agnieszka's going to leave the capital shortly,
Yeah.
and it's going to relocate to something else. But that just means that the capital's like just being abandoned, fucking being completely taken over by the wood, right? Because like it's everywhere at this stage. The Queen, possibly Marek, like.
Possibly like one of the 5 other books they haven't burned yet.
Yeah, totally. They just dropped that. Oh yeah, there was 5 books came from Russia, and then that never got resolved.
Also, did they actually finish burning that book?
Yes.
When
That
they
one
were
did
burning
die.
it, and then
Yeah, Alosha did. What do we think of Alosha being attacked? How are we feeling about that?
Cool.
Oh, my reaching connections as well to people, but really, I'm kind of like, well, she's going to die at this point.
you know,
She's not significant enough.
has been 140 years dead. You know, it's about time she's gone.
Yeah, what's she been hanging on for, honestly?
She's a workaholic.
I love her so much. I love her so much. I think I fancy her.
Who doesn't?
That's appropriate.
I I mean, when we first met her, and she was wearing kick-ass like boots and trousers.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, any woman who has been working on a sword for 100 years, like, she gets my vote.
Get a game.
Damn right. Oof. Oof.
Yeah, I'm a bit sad she's gone. She could have been really cool in the battle against the wood.
She was really cool in the battle against the wood.
No, but like the final battle.
More.
The big boss battle.
Also,
Yeah.
One Agnieszka to have friends.
Yeah.
Yes.
The final battle is going to be a one-on-one between Agnieszka and the wood.
And then she'll be really old afterwards and lonely.
She can be friends with the dragon.
Yeah.
I think he's going to be in the final battle. It'll be the two of them against the wood, combining their magic, and it'll be
Cast a spell with me.
much less cool than if all of the cool witches did the thing together instead.
Yeah.
You think the dragon will die in that battle?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's wrong for this world.
And she can have a happily ever after with Merrick.
Or is the evil presence that is given the wood its like craziness, is it going to turn out to be Baba Yaga?
Oh yeah, we haven't heard about her for a while.
Oh, apparently she's
Frankie's
just a
giving us
legend
hints.
in the capital.
Oh wow.
Maybe Agnieszka.
Frankie, you look like you want to tell us things. Tell us things.
No, don't tell us anything.
Don't tell us things.
Tell me things.
I don't know.
Read it if you really want to, Katie.
I don't know.
Oh, don't tempt her.
No. Think how sad you'd be if you read ahead and then it was like the final one and everyone was all excited and you like knew what was going to happen already.
I'd still be excited.
I've read it years ago, Frankie, and I'm still enjoying it.
Oh, well, go ahead then. Go for it. Oh my god, we're so excited. We're so excited.
What do you think's going to happen to Kesha?
Wonder if she's
I feel like
gonna
she'll be in the
role
final
play,
battle
but
because
she's
she's got
pretty
there.
I think Cash is gonna. So
Cash in the lusher.
Cash is going to wield the sword because she's strong and cool and stuff. Why?
You're still recording, Frankie.
No regret.
Anyone who is watching this knows at this point everything. But yeah, that's